I always begin with a land acknowledgement. We honor, this is written specifically for where I'm located in the Denver area. And if you have one for your own area, you can reflect on that. We honor and acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. This area, specifically the confluence of the Platte and Cherry Creek rivers, was the epicenter for trade, information sharing, planning for the future, community, family, and ally building, as well as conducting healing ceremonies for over 45 indigenous nations. We must recognize indigenous peoples as the original stewards of these lands, and as these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, remember that these, remember the ties that these nations still have to their traditional homelands. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and support and pay our respect to the diverse indigenous peoples still connected to the land. Let us give thanks to all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. The authors, the co-editors of our first book, Women Rising In and Beyond the Arab Spring, are Rita, Stephan, and Maya Charrad. Rita is a research fellow at the Moise A. Carolla Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies at North Carolina State University, and the regional coordinator for religious and ethnic minorities at the United States Agency of International Development. She served as the director of the Middle East Partnership Initiative and the deputy director of data analytics at the U.S. Department of State, and as a survey statistician at the U.S. Census Bureau. She was a visiting researcher at Georgetown and lecturer of sociology and women's studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her publications focus on women's activism in the Middle East and North Africa, and the Middle Eastern population in the census. Her co-author, Maya, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Texas, Austin, and a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute at Rice University. Her book, States and Women's Rights, The Making of Post-Colonial Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, won numerous national awards, including Best Book in Sociology from the ASA. Congratulations, Maya. Her articles have appeared in major scholarly journals, and she's edited or co-edited Patrimonial Power in the Modern World, Patrimonial Capitalism and Empire, Women's Agency, Silences and Voices, and one more book whose title is in French, and Rita suggested I don't attempt to read it. So Maya, you can share the title if you wish. Her work has been translated into French, Arabic, and Chinese. And so Rita and Maya, I turn things over to you.
Thank you, Abby. In response to the questions that we were given, I think Maya will go first in answering a couple of questions, and then I'll answer the third question. Maya, go ahead.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Rita. Thank you, Abby, for the wonderful introduction. I am going to answer the first two questions. What's the book about? And what intersections inform our book? So first, what is the book about? Women Rising is about women's political resistance in 16 countries before, during, and since the Arab Spring protests first began in 2011. This edited volume provides an insight into a diverse range of perspectives across the entire movement, focusing on marginalized voices, including rural women, housewives, students, and artists. The 40 chapters reflect questions posed by local, national, and transnational activists on the topics of beliefs, identity, agency, mobilization, and resistance. I will now answer the second question. What intersections inform your book? Women Rising presents resistance, revolution, and reform as three theoretical concepts that correspond to three bodies of literature: political sociology, social movements, and feminism. Within the framework of political sociology, we look at the rupture in the political structure that allowed women and activists to take advantage of significant historical moments and exercise their agency to demand social and political change. Building on social movement theory, we explore how women mobilized by combining struggle for democracy with activism for gender equality. I think that was absolutely central to the Arab Spring, and how they sought to consolidate their gender identity and identification with the nation. Themes such as sexual identity, sexuality, social status and class, religious beliefs, ethno-sectarian backgrounds, and positionality as members of non-Western societies are some of the intersections that inform our work and many of the chapters. Thank you.
And I will address the question on how gender and gender theory informs our work. First, Women Rising explores a multiplicity of identities, strategies, contexts, and spaces in which Arab women resisted. It also offers an empirical account of their agency. Before this book, you had very few accounts of Arab women's agency specifically. Theoretically, we stand to rebuke some of the narratives that have been advanced by Western, transnational, and third world feminisms that have stripped Arab women of their claim to feminism. Often accused of lacking feminist consciousness or feminist identity, Women Rising offers an alternative perspective on Arab women's agency and shows them not as victims par excellence, as we hear often, or subordinate to their oppressive, patriarchal, and Islamic settings. Rather, we argue that Arab women activism does not always have to be a bargain with patriarchy, as we're often told by our colleagues, and that Arab women's agency is relevant and also informing to solving not only local Middle Eastern issues, but also global social problems. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. Our second book today is authored by Heather McKee Hurwitz. Are We the 99%? The Occupy Movement, Feminism, and Intersectionality. Heather's a lecturer of sociology and a feminist scholar at Case Western Reserve University and a visiting researcher at the Cleveland Clinic. For nearly 20 years, she's been participating in and studying a variety of social movements in the US and global South, including feminist, anti-war, student, environmental, and Occupy movements. She analyzes contemporary urban protests, social movements, health disparities, and patients' experiences using a feminist and intersectional lens. With a grant from Case Western Reserve University's Friedman Center for Digital Scholarship, she has developed a digital Occupy archive of the data that informed the book. All of the flyers, posters, newspapers, postcards, and more movement ephemera is all freely available to the public online. And Heather, you can let us know, but I'm guessing that this website addressed here is where we can find all of that material?
You can find a link to that material there, a link to the archive, yes, at that link. And then there's a whole lot more, the instructor guide, a student study guide, and some other materials that could help if you want to include the book in a class.
Wonderful. So please share with us some detail about your book.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And also, I'm so excited to read Rita and Moira's book because we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring. And the Occupy movement came after the Arab Spring, very much inspired by the activism that was happening across the Arab world. And so I detail the Occupy movement, and I was a student, an activist, a researcher, and a feminist looking at that movement. And so I use that lens. And I actually want to start by reading Ruth Milkman's quote, because I think it sets a good orientation for understanding the book and my contributions. So in the most nuanced analysis to date of gender and intersectional dynamics of the Occupy movement, Hurwitz probes the contradictions beneath the slogan, "We are the 99%." Beautifully illuminating the tyranny of structurelessness, she argues that pre-existing hierarchies privileging white male occupiers over women, people of color, and sexual minorities fractured the movement and hastened its demise. Yet also shows efforts by feminists and others within the Occupy movement to dismantle those hierarchies ultimately strengthen the movement. And so I'm so thankful for Ruth for explaining the book in this way. And so to build on that, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Occupy movement, the idea was, if you're not the 1% most wealthy, we have a reason to come together and create a movement. And this idea of the 99% was this all-encompassing, inclusive class. And yet, by speaking with so many feminists, women, genderqueer persons of many races and ethnicities, they told me, no, we cannot really explain our class inequality as we're part of the 99%. This framework does not focus on intersectionality, and yet our lives are at the intersection of gender and racial inequalities and inequalities we face because of our sexualities. And this movement is not really addressing those. So that's where the question, are we the 99%, comes in. And a lot of people were questioning this in the movement. And I reveal this tension throughout the movement and the ways that individuals said, we need a much more intersectional view of our lives. We want to be recognized specifically for how we're enduring the Great Recession, and we want a social movement that's going to use that intersectional view to support us. And so my analysis reveals the way that the movement was unified. I mean, this was an exciting idea of the 99%. I was interested in it myself. I mean, I wanted economic equality, but the ways that there were also many fault lines. And one of the places where the tyranny of structurelessness that Ruth Milkman mentions, where it showed up in the movement was around leadership. And this is one of my key contributions to gender theory in the book. So this was a horizontal movement, a movement without hierarchical leadership. It was voluntary, it was rotating. So anyone theoretically could volunteer to take on this leadership role. And I wanted to study this movement because it was filled with these active leaders and followers. And when I say followers, it's nothing diminishing of followers. Actually, the movement, and I believe this as well, felt that followers are collaborators with leaders. They play a really important role, and they're actually very powerful in following along with what leaders say, helping them to make decisions and carry out the movement's goals. And this is also called relational leadership theory, conceptualizing that followers and leaders really reinforce each other. And I found the followers to be very powerful. And in fact, they could really legitimate certain leaders and kind of throw their weight behind certain leaders who were pulling the movement in one way or another. But they ended up falling back on expected stereotypical views of who the legitimate leaders were. And following white men was kind of a default, and accepting a new vision of leadership, women of color leaders, indigenous leaders, was not something that people in the movement were readily doing. And I create this concept, discriminatory resistance, to actually name the kind of ignoring, marginalizing, not following, even harassing that followers did of especially women and genderqueer leaders. And so we've heard about some of these practices in the corporate setting, ignoring what women say until a man says those things, and defaulting to men leading government and corporations. And here I bring that gender theory and even more of an intersectional analysis of leadership into examining social movements and team-based non-hierarchical leadership structures. So I'd love to tell you more in the Q&A about the other intersectional dynamics I examined from the movement's messages and their committee work, and how the kind of movement dynamics and what feminists did in the movement. I'll leave that for the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Hopefully we'll have a lot of time for that.
Awesome.
And then let me move the slide here. Great. Our third book is Nevertheless, They Persisted: Feminisms and Continued Resistance in the U.S. Women's Movement, edited by Jo Reger. Jo was professor of sociology, the chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, Social Work, and Criminal Justice at Oakland University in Michigan, and a former editor of Gender and Society. She's the author of Everywhere and Nowhere: Contemporary Feminism in the United States, the editor of this text. Sorry, I'm reading a written bio. She also is editor of Different Wavelengths: Studies of Contemporary Feminism in the United States, and a co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Women's Social Movement Activism. Her work on the U.S. women's movement has appeared in a variety of journals, including Gender and Society, Qualitative Sociology, Feminist Formations, and the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography. Her latest research project examines music in the women's movement of the 1960s to the 1980s. So welcome, Jo. We're excited to hear about your edited volume.
Thank you, Abby. Well, let me just say, my internet's been a little wonky today, so let me know if you can hear me. And I'm also really pleased to be on this panel. I just finished a work where I cited both Heather and Rita. So I'm all like, yay, it's so fun to see you in person. So I think the way to talk about this book is to talk about how it came about. And it was really supposed to be an update of the volume Abby just mentioned, Different Wavelengths, Studies of the Contemporary Women's Movement. And I did that volume mostly because in the 1990s and early 2000s, I was constantly being asked, like, how dead is feminism? Is it like dead or like dead, right? And so I wanted to put together a collection of works that showed that it was still alive and that people were studying it. And so that's what that volume did. And I was asked to update it. And so I started to work on a second volume called Different Wavelengths 2, which was just kind of continue. It's going to update it, have some new articles. And this is right after President Trump was elected, and we saw the women's movement, the women's marches happening around. And I realized that I really wasn't answering the same question as before. I went from saying, you know, feminism isn't dead, you may not see it, but it's there, to here is feminism, you see it. And people were saying to me, like, where did all this come from? And so I wanted to put together a volume that really answered where the roots of feminism had been, that allowed us to see these global marches, this kind of outpouring of feminism intertwined with so many different issues. And so I drew on, and this was a suggestion of a friend, but I drew on Mitch McConnell when he censured Elizabeth Warren and saying that nevertheless she persisted. And when I thought about nevertheless they persisted, feminisms and continued resistance, I felt like that was an answer to part of the question, which is where did all this activism come from? And I will just tell you as a side note, when you try to change your title after you told your publishing company you wanted to call it one thing, it's really hard. And Amazon has a tremendous amount of control on what you call your book once it gets in the system. So just to let you know, in case you write a book, make sure you like the title. And so I really started to think about this work, about how there have been activists and issues that have continued over time. So what I really like about this book is that it's embedded, many of the chapters are embedded in history, but all of them also speak to kind of contemporary, the contemporary movement, and then draw on theory. So we have this nice mixture of theory and empirical studies in each chapter. So just to give you an example, well, Heather has a chapter in it, which is fabulous. But one of my favorite chapters is by Miriam Abelson, who wrote a chapter on trans feminist history. And Abelson calls this the histories, hurdles, and futures. And so Abelson really looks at the barriers, but also the openings for transgender people to be engaged in feminism in different ways. And so there's this reclaiming of history, but at the same time, there's an opening to understand the complexity of those relationships and where the future can potentially be. In another chapter, Nancy Whittier looks at sexual assault on college campuses, and she takes this timeline that takes us back to kind of radical feminists beginning to articulate rape, all the way up to, you know, the Obama letter to colleges, and then Trump begins to roll all this back. So we get a sense of the history, the strategies, the tactics, and the outcomes that get engaged in these different ways that feminism is embedded all over our society. So I like the multiplicity of all the chapters. And if you look at the background of my slide, those are basically the titles and the chapters that are in there. So in terms of this idea of how does it replace, how is it informed by intersections, I think a key component in many of the chapters is the idea of intersectional feminism. And Fatma Suarez opens up the book with a chapter on Chicana women and Chicana feminism and the role they play in the articulation of intersectional theory and the way they've played a role in the women's marches. And she even has photos that kind of illustrate. So she draws us in. All the chapters do have some aspect of intersectionality, looking at a wide range of social identity. So what I feel like the end result of this is that it really incorporates history, theory, and political studies. It looks at 21st century feminism. And I'm particularly proud of the mixture of authors in this volume. Some of them were graduate students when they wrote chapters. Some of them were senior scholars. And it was different when I tried to put this volume together in 2005. There weren't as many people working on issues around the women's movement and feminism. And there's so many more people now engaging in it. And so I'll say it's a slim volume because there's so much more that could be covered, but I think there's a lot of information, a lot of coverage of what's happening in 21st century in it, 21st century feminism in it.
Thank you, Joe. Terrific. It is nice seeing the subject of the chapters in the background of the slide.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
There's like abortion, trans feminism, menstrual activism. There's pictures from Judy Chicago in there. So, you know.
Great. I don't know how it can be a slim volume. That's a lot. So as I mentioned, we have some questions that have been provided to us by the Salon committee. And I think your answers will differ in approach because one of your books is, just a single authored manuscript. Another is edited and another is co-edited. So the questions don't exactly apply in the same way, but of course are interested in hearing your insights into really what the spirit of the question is. And the first one is, how did feminist praxis inform your approach to the project? How did feminist praxis inform your approach? Rita and Maya, should we start with you?
Yes, happy to answer that question. Want to say first the two praxis inform our project. One, the transnational feminism, and the second one is, can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
And the second one is third world feminism. And with transnational feminism and looking at inequality across nationality, sex, class, and race, and also emphasizing the subaltern identity that exists among victims of colonialism and imperialism. And what we found that, you know, colonial powers, though indeed are have been oppressive and are oppressive past and present, Arabs' relationship with them have been complicated before the Arab Spring and after, especially when you see through foreign assistance and donors programs that women's organizations are actually aided by these imperialist and colonist powers. The second praxis that you know, we looked at is how Arab women's activism and feminism compares with the literature we have on third world feminism. And we looked at the majority of the cases that are studied in third world feminism focus on Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas in the Arab countries are not typical of Arab of third world culture, socioeconomic characteristics. You have the you know, the Gulf, which did experience the Arab Spring, such as Bahrain, which is the highest GDP per capita, vis-a-vis Yemen, which is the poorest country in the world by far. And so, how do you deal with this hybrid and heterogeneous economic, political, and social contexts, and how did women resist across all these contexts is something that we looked at. Over.
Can I add a footnote to that? Who is moderating us, Abby? Okay. I think one very simple, direct, and in my opinion, really important way that we look at feminist praxis is that in this book, when we put it together, we made a concerted effort to combine feminist writing by analysts, social scientists of different persuasions, and activists who are not engaged in writing about gender issues and feminism, but who are actually doing things in their country. And learning from them was a great learning experience. So we do have activists in the book. And that to me is the ultimate feminist practice in a way. So that was one. And then I think the other that I think the other side of the book that I see as directly relevant to feminist practice is that, to build on what Rita was saying, in most of the Middle East and North Africa, feminists were engaged in public life and in making demands, strongly combine their feminism with democracy, that their demands are not only centered on issues of the economy, but because we were dealing with countries where the political system was on the whole heavily authoritarian, we have to remember that being a feminist in an authoritarian system and being a feminist in a place where, at least in theory, people have freedom of expression is not the same. So in most of our cases, being a feminist also meant fighting for democracy in a variety of ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita and Maya. Joe, would you mind addressing that question next? Because some of the issues that they raised in terms of selecting the voices present in the text were similar to decisions you had to make also as an editor.
Yeah, you know, and as I was listening, I was thinking about how this intersection of activism in theory and activism in empiricism is really engaged throughout this entire book. And as I said, Fatima Suarez's pictures are pictures she took that illustrate the book that when she was in a women's march. And so many of the people who wrote chapters actually participated. Heather's in it. We have some Occupy stuff, right? But it's this collaboration that I think feminist scholars do so well, of taking their activism into academia and then using that, the combination, that intertwining as a way to kind of build greater understandings. And that's one of the things I really like about the chapters. I have to say, I didn't particularly select people that I knew were activists, because most of the people that I know are activists. And I think it was like it was a little farther back in my brain. But I also think there's something very activist, particularly in a society that continuously, and just recently, you know, has called the end of feminism, the end of the women's movement, the end of the need for these struggles. I think there's something activist in being an academic that writes the history and refuses to let the history be erased, and makes the history complex. And not to just pick on the same two chapters, but that's one of the reasons why I like Miriam Abelson's chapter so much, is it's not a story of banishment of trans men and women. It's a story about incorporation along with barriers, along with harassment, along with welcoming, along with success, and along with failure. And I think there's something activist in that act. So I would say literally everyone in the book has some foot in activism that is feeding the work that they are doing as feminist scholars.
Thank you. Heather, do you want to respond to that question? How did feminist praxis inform your approach?
Sure. Well, something that Joe just said really resonates with me, on that telling this history and making it complex. And I hadn't thought of it in that way, but I feel that is very much part of my project. I set out for my dissertation wanting to study a movement that was mixed gender, to try to understand how there could be a movement where women, men, and genderqueer people were participating together in it and, you know, making the movement happen. And I definitely had that side of the story, but as using feminist methods, I quickly found other sides of that story. So, you know, reports of sexual harassment, even rape happening in Occupy encampments, and the marginalization of especially women leaders, were stories that emerged near the beginning of the movement. And it was a challenge to pick up that material and kind of deal with activists sharing with me really difficult stories about the oppressions that they were facing in the movement. But I think that that's a big part of doing feminist praxis, is revealing those places where we still need feminism, and then also, as much as we can, celebrating when feminism is happening. And so You know, I also participated in the movement. I wanted to be a part of making change. I wanted this book, what I wrote, but also even my participant observation in the movement to be a part of making change. So I'm remembering being with a group of women, and the goal of the movement was to kind of take power away from these big banks who were doing, you know, who were kind of getting bailed out. Main Street wasn't getting bailed out during the Great Recession. And we went to these banks and we were throwing bras at the banks saying, bust up the banks, right? And kind of using femininity to make this kind of play on words and get women involved in the movement. So both the participation and studying this movement, seeking out women's voices and feminist voices, addressing those instances of sexism and racism in the movement. And then the book is a kind of call to action to do things really differently, to learn from this movement and go forward. And I think some social movements have really done that over the last 10 years. And I think they really learned from the problems of the Occupy movement, but I'm kind of back to Joe's statement again. You know, we have to remember this difficult history so that we don't repeat it again, because I think the Occupy movement repeated some of kind of the sexism of the New Left or the marginalization of women of the civil rights movement. We somehow have to learn this history, and I think it's possible to create very diverse mixed gender movements that don't have those fault lines, but we have to learn from it. So
thank you, Heather. I'm going to jump around with the questions that we were provided, because I think one of the later questions really connects with what you've been talking about, all of you, and especially Heather right now. So this question asks us, who do you see as the audiences for your book, and how do you see them using the work in their subfields, disciplines, or courses? And I think for all of your work, it's especially important to ask also, how do you see the activists involved in the movements that you were working with using this book? Do you see it as useful for them? And Heather, thinking about what you were just saying, how do you hope it might be useful in the future in shaping the ways that movements organize and the relationship between leadership and followers, et cetera? Do you want to start, Heather?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. One of the audiences I'm hoping to reach are young activists who maybe came into political life with the Me Too movement, with Black Lives Matter, even this summer, with the protests for justice for George Floyd, or even activists who became active with the Bernie Sanders mobilizations. Some people don't really know this history, even though, you know, Bernie Sanders, let's say, has been this champion of the 99% and really railing against the 1%. Well, how did he get there? He got there because the Occupy movement opened that up for him, and he built on those social media networks that the movement had built. So I think that young activists are, you know, they know a lot. I think intersectionality is a part of young people's activism today, but I think kind of knowing some of this movement history isn't so much a part of what they know. So that's one of the audiences I'm really hoping to reach. And of course, I think it's a great book for talking about feminism in not explicitly feminist movements. We have such a diverse feminist movement with so many different goals and ways of achieving those goals. And a lot of that was happening in Occupy. And so I think that's an important audience. And then last, I'll say I've actually been on a handful of radio shows recently, and I'm finding that the outlet to talk about this recent period of activism and just kind of digest, like, where are we? What more do we need to do for women leaders? You know, we have Kamala Harris as the vice president, sort of like do we still have more to do? I mean, this is a really important dialogue in the public domain. And so I hope the book reaches there as well. I think you're muted, Abby.
Sorry, thank you.
You're welcome.
So who would like to respond next? We don't have to move in any specific order. And if you want to pass on a question, you're welcome to. Just unmute yourself. Maya?
I'd like to kind of follow up with what Heather said.
Sure, go ahead, Joe, and then we'll turn to Maya.
You know, I think a lot of these chapters also speak to the current dialogue that's going on, the activism that we saw over the summer with Black Lives Matter, the pushback against protests. I'll even go back to the Me Too movement, and people were like, why are women so upset? You know, like, where did this come from? And I think, you know, and every once in a while I get interviewed, and it just feels like such an educational effort to get reporters to understand that these are not brand new things and that they have longer histories. Now, do I think my book is going to be read by a lot of the general public? I don't know. Academic books have a hard time making that leap, so I'm not gonna forecast that. One of the reasons I wrote this book and why I write a lot of stuff is I feel like a lot of times the way we educate people about women's movements, and particularly the US women's movement, boils down to like this 3-sentence, there was the first wave where they wanted the vote, and the second wave where they wanted the ERA, and then the third wave where, you know, and then people are like, there's a 4th wave and a 5th wave. And I feel like that history is so, it's not useful. And when a lot of times we're telling that history to potential, or not even potential, but young activists who don't get a firm grounding in the complexities around race and ethnicity and gender identity and sexual identity. And the story gets so flattened and so simplified that I feel like there's something that needs to happen within the education system of how we tell that story. And I see that story even being told in children's books, right? I mean, I don't know how complex you get, but you know, you'll see the story of Susan B. Anthony, and it's very, very simple. And it's like, I think our children deserve something a little more complex. And I think our students deserve something much more complex, because they go off into organizations and they have these very kind of flattened understandings of how all of these different social identities have intertwined in movements. And so I think, just to build a little bit on Heather, I think there's a real need for that there. Now, I wrote the book, you know, the prospectus says it will be used in these types of classes and it'll be of interest, but I really wanted it in women and gender studies, social movement classes where there are young, interested activists.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maya?
Yeah, I want to answer the question of the audience for the book and how we thought of it. I think multiple audiences. One is in the US, feminists in the US, and gender scholars in the US, in Western Europe, that are interested in a global perspective and in teaching on countries other than the US and Western Europe. So that is one audience. I think also similar category in the Middle East and North Africa, where there is a great need for more books on feminism and activism, so that I think we need to have a balance. And we meant this book as a counterweight to the heavy emphasis on Islamic feminism in the region. Everybody has heard about Islamic feminism, and there has been a lot written on that. We wanted something different, another set of voices, both in this country and in the Middle East and North Africa itself. Another audience that I hope will be interested in the book is less an audience of scholars and more an audience of activists. I am hoping that our book will bring to the fore the message that there are many forms of feminist activism and that it is possible to explore and use some of those forms even in the face of repression, because many feminist activists are still living under repressive conditions. And I'm hoping the message of the book to be one of hope and to show that women have really found many different ways of expressing their feminism, whether it be as artists, whether it be as musicians, as scholars, as whatever else. But being an activist is not only going to a big demonstration in the middle of the square in Cairo or Tunis, that there are other forms. And finally, I see this book as a, I hope also, a contribution to third world feminism. I was just rereading an article yesterday by Hare on why transnational feminism needs third world feminism. And I think this book is part of the scholarship that shows that the conditions under which feminists live will shape their feminism. And that's the essence of third world feminism. So in the book, we show not only how feminists in the region as a whole devise their feminism on the basis of the conditions that surround them, but we also go one step further, and I think the book suggests differences among the countries that have their own specific conditions. So those are the audiences that hopefully will be interested in the book. Those are the ones that we were addressing. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. And it's really interesting to hear the common threads throughout all of your responses, especially in terms of thinking about the really superficial and non-historical perspectives that I know my students are bringing to the classroom this week. And it really, not having that fuller understanding of the diverse forms of activism, the very diverse ways in which social movements have proceeded in the past, the conflicts within them, the different ways in which leadership has been modeled. It really is leading to, I think, for a lot of young students, and especially white students, this kind of sense of paralysis and helplessness, and not, thinking that social change should happen quicker, because they don't have that understanding of what it's taken to create change in the past. And so, certainly it's a feminist project to make sure that this kind of history is being taught. So thank you all. Next question I want to ask you is about the process of doing this work. There could be much joy, but also many challenges in writing for publication. And I'm sure that's something everyone here has experienced or is about to face. So reflecting upon your practices as an author or as an editor or as a co-editor, what helped to keep you going and push you to the finish line of getting this work out there? I know it could be a very long process from start to finish. Who would like to start? Anyone? Just go ahead, Rita. Thanks.
I can figure out where the unmute button is. This project started, and I'm ashamed to say, but it started in 2013, so many years ago. But, it grew out of frustration, really, of hearing the media saying, for the first time ever, Arab women are joining their brethren. And, you know, Arab women finally, you know, as if nothing existed before this historical moment. And so we put out a call for paper, and frankly, the amount of entries, I don't know if any of you had paid attention to the book, it's 40 chapters. And everybody told us, you're crazy to have 40 chapters. How are you going to do it? But the breadth of the contribution from filmmakers to activists to politicians, to you know, and scholars, junior scholars writing from Japan, writing from Australia, you know, wanting to contribute, really dictated the size of this book and the variety of the contributions. And then we started, Maya and I, asking the senior scholars, we want to wait for this book. And I remember NYU Press saying, we couldn't get anyone to review this book because everyone who knows anything about gender politics in the Middle East is contributing to this book. And we wanted to have everybody have a say in this. And went back and forth, Maya and I editing and deciding how do you divide 40 chapters. But I want to say two interesting things that were a challenge, but we solved them. One is the title of the book. You know, the press wanted to call it Arab Women Rising, and we insisted on women rising because we didn't want to be on the Middle Eastern studies shelf. We wanted to be in women's studies shelf and gender studies shelf, because we felt that this contribution really was making, that we're making is for gender studies in general, not just, you know, pigeonholed us in, you know, regional studies, which is where scholars, you know, who focus on the Middle East get pushed to. The second thing is protests kept on happening and we couldn't catch up, right? So there was, you know, we stopped at the 2016, 2017, and then Sudan happened, and then Algeria happened. And so what do we do? And then you'll see that Lady Liberty of Sudan made it to our book. And that was both a statement of inclusivity and multiplicity of the experience of Arab women. The artist, the activist who is featured on the cover of our book is Black. Skin-wise, she's Black. Ethnicity-wise, she's Black. She's African, right? So this was sending a message of the multiplicity of experiences and the intersectionality of race and class and really geopolitical context. And then finally, how do we get this image? We had to trace the actually the photographer who took it and wire money across countries to get it. And Maya, I couldn't do it because I have a security clearance. So Maya was sending money, and it was really quite the experience. Thank you. You're on mute, Abby.
Sorry. Thank you. I was just asking if anyone else wanted to jump in. I think it's great that you shared how long it took to get that book from start to finish line, because that's another myth. People often have no idea it can take that long, and it's not uncommon.
Well, you know, there's an old joke that says, why edit a book when you can write one in half the time? And I don't actually think that's true. I think that underestimates what it takes to write a book. But,
Yeah.
you know, just thinking about my process, I think I spent, I didn't do an open call because I knew there were certain things I wanted to address. I knew I wanted to address variety as a different activist. I wanted to talk about intersectional feminism. I wanted to talk about issues of sexual assault on campus. So I had ideas of people to write things. And so some people agreed right away. And sometimes I searched for a long time to find, through networks, to find people that were able to do certain chapters. And there were a couple authors that I literally begged. They were like, I can't make that deadline. I'm about, how about 3 more months? How about 2 more months? I'm like, whatever, I want you to do this so badly that I will come over to your house and you can just tell me what you think the chapter should say and I will write it because I want this in here. But I think the cool part is that I drew on really 3 generations of kind of scholars. I went to my advisor, Rita Taylor, who hooked me up with some of her students and students that she knew. I went to Heather and Allison Crossley's generation, and they had networks that I wasn't aware of. And then I went to my own generation and hit up some of the people that I knew and asked for suggestions. So I think that helped get a lot of different generations of feminists kind of coming together to do this. But, you know, editing a book, it takes time. I think I spent more time emailing people than I probably did editing their chapters. I spent more time trying to find people. And I think that often is the case. Like if you're looking for specific things, it can take a while for you to put together the book that makes the most sense, that's making the statement that you want to make. So that was kind of my process.
Thanks. Your comments are making me think it might be really helpful if someone offered a workshop on how to edit the book, right? Especially hearing from co-editors and single editors, all of the very different approaches that you can take and should think about in advance. Heather?
Yeah, I'll just build on that a little bit in saying it's amazing to hear about the communities behind these books. And I'm so, I read Joe's book, but I haven't read Rita and Maya's. I'm really, really excited to read it. And it might be perhaps a little more obvious when you read an edited volume that a community was involved, all of the co-authors. But I think that I have my book because of this feminist community of scholars. Thank you, to Joe, Mignon, Jennifer, all read early drafts of the book and provided me feedback. Charrad and Susan were always, supportive of me in our work in the International Committee for SWS, and we kind of checked in with each other on what we're working on and just provided that support. And I think that's really important in writing any book, to have those kinds of wins from your community and support from your family. I had another win in the cover of the book is artist Megan Wilson. She's based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I mentioned her because when I approached her, I loved her art. I didn't know her personally beforehand, but I came across a lot of art in the Occupy movement, and her image always struck me. And when I contacted her and said, could we use your art as the cover of the book? She said, well, send me a chapter. And so I did. And she wrote me back and said, I think it's really important that we recognize these tensions in the movement. I was a part of them. That's why I had one foot in Occupy and one foot putting up these posters all over the community to kind of bring in people of different races and ethnicities. And I want to support your book because you kind of recognize that and tell the story of the decolonized movement within Occupy to change it. And it was moments like that, hearing from the activists themselves, the participants, and the feminist community, that no matter how tough it was to make it through my to-do list and somehow meet the reviewers' remarks about the book and kind of find my voice, that kept me going.
Thank you. So it's about time that we should be turning over to a general question and answer period. So we haven't gotten through all the questions we were given in advance, but I'd rather open it up so we can hear from everyone. And authors, panelists, feel free to pose questions for each other as well. See someone there, hi. It's always fun to see a kid or a pet, right? So anyone want to start? We don't have a huge number here, so feel free to just unmute yourself or wave your hand or whatever. Katie?
Hi. So I'm going to ask the question that everyone's asking in one form or another these days. How do you think the pandemic is going to inform feminist activism going forward?
Maya?
I'm not 100% sure how to answer this question right now. I was discussing that with my class today, actually, how the pandemic changes all kinds of things. And, you know, as somebody who lives here, who works here, who is an academic here, but who also connects to what's going on in other countries in many different ways, some personal, some academic and professional. One thing that's going to happen, which I think is unavoidable, is increase in inequality globally. The hope here, even in England, where the pandemic is raging worse than anywhere else, even in Italy, is that there will be a vaccine that is cheap enough and can be given to enough of us in this country. I mean, I believe that that's likely to happen. How countries that are poor are going to afford vaccines and what's going to happen in those countries with the pandemic, I don't know. So I think that feminists here and elsewhere are going to have to be aware of a possibility of increased global inequality of great, great dimensions. How we're going to respond, I don't know. I just think that that's an issue that I see ahead of us. That's all I can say.
I think one of the things, the pandemic, that I've been thinking a lot about is it's revealed kind of the fragility of the system that held women's lives together. And as soon as you didn't have all day school for your children to go to, you had to be at home using the same technology. If you had sufficient technology, what happened with the women who are essential workers, and not just to focus on academia, but what's going to happen to young women scholars, productivity, their tenure and promotion rates and reappointment rates, the economic bump you get from those things. You know, we're delaying things for a year, but there's still these economic issues. I've watched my own faculty have to pay people to come sit in the house next to their kindergartners so that they can get online and teach their classes while their husband's in the so I think contemporary feminism, I think feminist activists need to start looking at this system that we thought was holding, that we thought was going to be propelling women forward is really pretty fragile. And it didn't take very much for it to really break and for it really to have some very serious ramifications on women's lives. And so just to go back to something Heather said about Kamala Harris, so people are like, women have made it, but I think we have so much evidence that women have not made it. And I'm using a US lens right now. So to go back to, this idea of what happens if we open this globally and we look at the devastation. So I think there is something, it's going to take us back to some of these key questions that about household responsibilities, domestic labor, women's, the roles women play in the labor market, how secure is their financial future. Those are all questions that we have been dealing with literally for generations. And I think the pandemic is making them very clear. So hopefully we will start to focus on and think about how to address some of these core systems.
I appreciate all of those comments, Joe and Maya. Those issues are absolutely on my mind. And I'll just add in, Katie, that we have 10 years of really vibrant activism, a women's movement coming out into the streets in ways that we haven't seen before, a new civil rights movement in the streets, a new online activism from the ways that Facebook moved people in the Arab world, and that translated to Spain and the Occupy movement. There are a lot of new tools and practices, and I think protest has become more maybe common, accepted, something people feel compelled to do. I can't predict whether there's going to be another Arab uprising or that will spark a global movement or Occupy type of thing, but based on what Maya and Joe have kind of put on the table, I wouldn't be really surprised if that would happen. We're so much more savvy with social media today, but we'll just see. There's definitely grievances there for people to act, and I hope they will.
I can add a different perspective. There's a part of my bio that I try to not pay attention to, and that is public service, working for the State Department and USAID now. And when the pandemic hit, I was one of the activists within the system that said we have to pay attention to women's status, domestic violence, allocate some funds to support all that. And I don't want to blame any administration. I want to say the bureaucracy of policy making said this is not important. This is not, we have more urgent issues, right? And that is economic well-being and the health interventions. So until we now hear in many countries, especially in the Middle East, domestic violence is on the rise. And even in countries where we have laws in place, they have not been implemented because of the pandemic. And whose responsibility is this? Early warning system, enough policies, enough funding? I don't know. But this is a question that, should something like this happen again, the world is not ready to address gender issues and gender inequalities. Over.
Just jump in. If you want to pose a different question, feel free.
Could I ask the panelists and all of you, I wonder about a connection between the feminist movement and the racial reckoning. If we think of protests over the last year, many of them were around Black Lives Matter and other sort of racial protests. And do you see an overlap with the feminist movement there? Do you see any coming together, any common cause?
I think so, very much so. I think what's interesting about feminism as we've seen it in the last, well, probably 5 years, but even farther back, is the way it's intertwined with so many issues. And I think about the women's marches where you could see immigration reform, Black Lives Matter, climate change, along with sexual harassment, women's inequality. So I think one of the ways that we miss what feminism is doing is when we miss feminism in other movements, which is basically Heather's book, right? Heather's point. But I think, we often think if it's not specifically about women, and often we construct the view of white women, right, in that issue. So I think in Black Lives Matter protests, the fact that we now are talking about the whole campaign and the educational effort about say her name, which has a feminist component to it, right? It's like when we only focus on certain populations, certain genders, we miss violence. The violence that Black women have experienced and the killings they have experienced haven't even had the same recognition. So I think it's there. I think it's there already. I think there's ways that feminism diffuses into other movements about leadership styles, about you know, slogans, campaigns, we call them frames in social movements, tactics, strategies. You know, movements diffuse into each other, and I think feminism has been around long enough that we see it in a lot of contemporary movements, at least portions of it.
Mhm.
The way I think about it too is, and I agree with your points, Joe, very much, and that's how I kind of see this moment. I think about the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement who coined the phrase, 3 queer Black women who were very much steeped in intersectionality. And I feel like that's really a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's attention to the class experiences. There's a view about bringing in LGBTQ issues and transgender rights into the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a broad platform that recognizes the only way that we are going to have racial justice is if we recognize the kind of racial justice that Black women need and trans women need, etc. So I think that sets a really different tone for the Black Lives Matter movement. I see a pretty great contrast between Black Lives Matter and the Occupy movement in that way. And so that I would say is very feminist, what they're doing.
Well, and just to add to that, Heather, you made me think about the fact that there have been several people who are calling Black Lives Matter a reproductive justice movement because it's mothers losing children. And so mothers are seeing this as a part of what we should be talking about when we talk about reproductive justice or reproductive health. What does it mean to lose your children to violence? And so, again, I see that thread, right? That interweaving of kind of these feminist ideas, tactics, organizations are so vitally important there.
Go on, Maya, jump in.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
You know, listening to our conversation and thinking about the issue of the question you asked, where feminism will go in the future, it really strikes me how much issues of gender and race and feminism and the Black Lives Matter have become connected and linked in some very powerful ways that really cannot, much harder now to sort of separate and disentangle. And when I think about other regions, the linkages are really different and the challenges are different because the history of the countries is so different. And if we think, for example, about most of the Middle East and North Africa, about which we authors write in our book, you know, those countries do not have issues of race, but not like American society does. The history of slavery, the way the country was constituted, that is all really, really different. And so for the feminists in the region there, the challenge is really one of gender and democracy. That's how the connections are, and that cannot be disentangled. So I think that also sort of makes me more and more interested in dialogues among feminists in different parts of the world, because the issues are different, and they're different not so much because people want them to be different, but because they live in a very different structure and context, inherited from different histories of their own countries. So we need to build those bridges. We need to have those dialogues more and more for those reasons.
If I can add one more comment to the question, this is not irrelevant to our research. I want to say this question, and I want to give it in three contexts. First, when George Floyd was killed, there were protests outside the American embassy through the embassies throughout the world, including in the Middle East and North Africa. And these were not only Americans living abroad, these were activists who stand for social justice and sympathize with our social problems. And many of them were women activists who saw the connection between their struggle and our struggle. The second issue is the connection that many Arab activists made between George Floyd specifically and an exact same image of a Palestinian youth under the foot of an Israeli soldier that received zero attention from the global community. And here we have not just racial inequality, but also, you know, geographical, you know, first world oppressed society versus third world oppressed society, or, you know, you guys know the Israeli Palestinian issues. And then thirdly, I want to pay attention to the allies community that protested along with the African American community in the United States. And there were many Arab Americans, there were many Asian Americans who protested, and white Americans who protested. And my daughter, who's 16, staged a protest with her friends in our city. And then we were doing research, and whenever you look, search Arab women protesting, you get there. But if you put Muslim women protesting, you get here. And so the framing, how those ethnic minorities who were sympathizers and were engaged in this, in rights, in protesting social injustice, how they were framed. And that's something that was even noticed by a 16-year-old, that, you know, I don't, you know, why do we have to be veiled to get recognized in the United States? And it's not just Linda Sarsour, it is also, you know, the image that makes the news. So these are the three ways that I can connect the question. Thank you. Over.
We have time for maybe one more question or comment. Cynthia?
Yeah, so particularly when Maya was talking about democracy movements, I was also thinking about images that we from here and elsewhere of women activists in anti-democracy movements on the other side. And I was wondering, you know, because we see more women in sort of non-traditionally feminine activism, not more than on the feminist side, but more than we would have seen before, perhaps. And I was, so for any or all of the authors, I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Rita, you want to answer that?
I couldn't hear, I'm sorry. I was hoping that someone would
couldn't
repeat
either.
the question.
Oh, was I?
You can turn up your own volume too.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Nah,
Oh, it's up. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
I'll just get closer to my laptop.
just make, Cindy,
with-
get close to your microphone. Just make sure you're close to your microphone. I could not hear, even though I had the volume up.
I was asking about women activists on the other side in anti-democracy struggles and movements, both in the United States and elsewhere. What
What about those women? What are you asking about them?
just any thoughts, because it seems like we're at least seeing images more of them than in the past, and whether people had any thoughts about that, or it comes up in your own research.
I can't say it's something that I'm really researching, but as someone who's living in Ohio right now, it is very much always on my mind. My dad really wants me to research why so many women vote for Trump. He thought he wished that I wrote that research, but that wasn't my research. I would just say the one connection to my research is we have a lot of work to do. Sexism, racism, inequality against LGBTQ persons, it's really, really deep. And I think that we can see how deep it is when women want to support hate movements and support movements that are so patriarchal. You know, a president who is a kind of champion of sexually harassing women. And to me, it's a kind of call to action, a reminder that we just can't be teaching our students about feminist movements. We have to kind of go beyond that to reach some of these people. How to do that, I'm not sure. And again, I'm not studying them really directly, but those are my thoughts on it.
Rita?
Yeah, 2 chapters in our book specifically answer this question. One is an interview that Maro Youssef did with Algerian feminists who supported the president. I don't want to call him dictator, but he's a product of the socialist system, President Bouteflika, till the very end. And for those, they supported the totalitarian regime because they were afraid of the alternative, which is the Islamist, because in their collective memory, it was the 1990 civil war in Algeria that produced Islamist control and Islamist attacks on personal freedom. The second chapter is actually by a Christian member of the Syrian parliament. So this is in Syria, that who speaks in her own voice on why she ran for office after the crisis in Syria, as she calls it. She said, "I agree there is a problem. I don't agree that this is the solution, that revolt and protest is the solution. So I'm going to work with the system to fix it." So this is, I think, maybe gives you 2 insights to those who are afraid of the alternative. And there have been many narratives about family values being under attack and you know, God knows what else, or also those who chose to work within the system and thought that they could be doing more from within than being on the outside protesting. Mm-hmm. It's just maybe 2 ways to think about it.
And I think it really is testament to the successes of feminism that we now see more and more women engaging as leaders and as activists across the entire political sphere and across political ideologies. So it's not only going to be feminists that benefit from the feminist movement, of course. Joe, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say really quickly, I mean, if we look at the history of the US women's movement, anti-suffrage, anti-ERA, a lot of times, you know, these are women who have a rationale, who feel like the better choice is to stick with the world as they know it, that they're being protected in some way. And we have to remember, never in the history of the United States have most women been feminists, even though we like to think so, and we can live in little bubbles that feel like it. You know, feminism is an oppositional movement. It opposes the status quo, and some women choose to align themselves with the status quo. Even in my home state of Ohio, which breaks my heart. I moved to Michigan. We're a little cooler than Ohio now. But, you know, so this idea that like, they don't know what they're thinking, they do know what they're thinking. They have a way of understanding the world. And it's often through, you know, academia, it's through women and gender studies courses, it's through conversations with other feminists that we make those differences. And so that's why I think all of the books here and all of the feminist researchers here are so important, because we're telling a story that's different than a narrative that's out there.
I think that's a great moment to bring us to the conclusion of this discussion. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all. It's been wonderful. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to the authors and editors for sharing your work. And